Our text for this afternoon is the first verse of Psalm 27, verse 1, and we'll read that verse again. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? Brothers and sisters, there's an old adage that there are only two things in life that we can be absolutely certain about, and those two things are death and taxes. Now, we could make a few comments about that old adage. First of all, we might note that it's rather theologically suspect. The reality is, if Jesus returns, when Jesus returns, then those who are alive at that time won't experience death. And so the reality is that death is not a certainty for everyone. And secondly, there is something rather ironic about this saying, because it suggests that there's actually a third thing that we can be certain about, and that is uncertainty itself. Because if the only things that are certain in this life are death and taxes, then it must certainly be the case that we can also be certain about uncertainty. And perhaps here at the close of the year 2023, you are experiencing that sense of uncertainty. Perhaps you may even be experiencing that sense of uncertainty in a very acute way. And that's because as we look forward to the coming year, we wonder naturally what will be. We wonder what is going to happen. And the reality is, as we meditate upon the year 2024 and we wonder what will happen and what will be, we're forced to admit that we do not know the answer to that question. You know, it's interesting, the Apostle Paul, he touches on our limitations in this regard in Romans chapter 8. There, Paul explains why at times we do not know what it is that we should pray for. And Paul tells us that the reason that we don't know what it is that we should pray for is because we are not God. And because we are not God, we don't know what God's will for our lives is. Because we're not God, we're not able to see the future. We don't understand always what His plan is or how we'll be led. And consequently, we lack the insight and the ability to pray in very specific ways about these things. And the reality is that we don't always know what is good, and we don't always know what is right, and we certainly don't know what will be. And we have difficulty then praying in conformity with what God has decreed for our lives. And so we're reminded of our frailty. We're reminded of our weakness. We're reminded of our limitation. And we're reminded of how, on account of our limitations, we often look to the future with a sense of fear. We often look to the future with a sense of anxiety. And for one reason or another, all of us will struggle to come to grips with our anxieties about the future. For instance, perhaps you're here today and the year 2023 has been a fantastic year for you. Maybe this has been a year that's been filled with successes, a year that's been filled with blessings. And you're truly thankful for all the goodness that you've enjoyed. And yet in the back of your mind, there may be a little anxious voice. A little anxious voice that wonders if maybe this season of blessing has run its course and maybe your fortunes might be changed in the coming year. We can wonder that about all kinds of things. Will my business continue to be successful? Will my studies continue to go well? Will my health and independence continue to be maintained? Or maybe you're sitting here this afternoon and 2023 has been filled with nothing but difficulty and nothing but disappointment. And you're just glad that this miserable year is finally coming to an end. But even as you stare at the clock and you watch the final hours of this year count down, that little anxious voice in the back of your head wonders if your suffering, if your griefs, if they might all just carry right on over to the next year. And you might be wondering if there's any hope of experiencing relief, any hope of experiencing God's goodness in the coming year. Or perhaps as you reflect back on 2023, all you're left with is the vague sense of fuzziness, a vague sense of fuzziness and a little confusion about just how another year has somehow managed to pass by. And as you contemplate the coming of another year, that little anxious voice in the back of your head is wondering that if at this time next year that you'll find yourself just as befuddled, and perhaps you'll find yourself in exactly the same place as you are right now. Or maybe you're here this afternoon and you're dealing with health concerns and you're wondering what the coming year will bring in terms of healing, or what the coming year will bring in terms of the progress of your illness. Perhaps some of you here today are grieving the loss of a loved one, and you're wondering how it is that you're going to move into the coming year without that person by your side. Or maybe you're a student, maybe you're a postgraduate student, and you know that your studies this year will be completed in April, and you're wondering about just what exactly that will mean, and just what exactly you'll do when they're done. Or perhaps worst of all, you're a graduate student. And then you really know the meaning of suffering and anxiety. Because grad school is just poverty, hunger, and insecurity wrapped all together in a neat little bow. The point is that there are all kinds of reasons. There are all kinds of reasons to feel anxious. There are all kinds of reasons to feel fear. There are all kinds of reasons to wonder what it is that will be in this new year. But against all those reasons for anxiety, there stands the testimony of the Scriptures. The Scriptures which declare that as God's people, we haven't been given a spirit of fear. The Scriptures that declare that we aren't to be governed by a spirit of anxiety. But if that's so, then the question becomes, what then is the antidote? What is the antidote for anxiety? How can we as God's people find the comfort we need in order to move confidently, in order to move boldly, in order to move peacefully and even joyfully into the year ahead? Well, brothers and sisters, Psalm 27 gives us the answer to that question. And the answer is that for God's people, the antidote to anxiety can be found in another certainty of this life. And that certainty is that the living God of heaven and earth, that He has never ceased to be a stronghold for His people. Now, why would David, in writing this song, why would he choose to describe God as being a stronghold? Well, if we think a little bit about who David was, we know some things about him. We know that David had been a warrior. We know that David had been a refugee. We know that David had been a king. And so we shouldn't be surprised when David latches on to military metaphors in his Psalms. David had, after all, experienced what it was like to be in various different kinds of strongholds. We know that over the course of his life that he would have found refuge in forest strongholds. We know that he took refuge in the caves and in the strongholds that were there. We know that as king, ultimately David ended his life living in Jerusalem, that great stronghold city of God's people. Now here's the thing, David had had an experience of many different kinds of strongholds, but what was common to them all is that they were always places of refuge. They were all places in which David had been placed beyond the reach of his foes. And so they were for him places of security. They were for him places of peace and of rest. And David wants us to be aware of how God Himself is a stronghold and a refuge for all of His people. And His concern here in telling us this through Psalm 27, it's not just so that He can provide us with a broad sense of peace of mind. No, David's concern here is to actually change and to shape our behavior. His concern here in particular is to keep us from acting in the ways that we tend to behave when we feel anxious and afraid. Because how is it, brothers and sisters, how is it that we behave when we're feeling like that? What is it that we do when we are feeling like the future is uncertain and we're feeling out of control in our lives? Well, in those circumstances, we have a tendency to try to reach out and we try to lay hold of the world around us. We try to put our hands on the things that we can control, so to speak. And we decide that we've got to bear down, and we decide that we've got to make some decisions. And we come to the conclusion that what we really need to do is to push on in our own strength. which means that when we're anxious and when we're afraid, we're often inclined to cease resting in God and to start advancing in our own wisdom and in our own strength. And David knew that. He knew that not just about us in general, but he knew that about himself. And he knew how disastrous a course that could be. And he knew these things because he had to learn this lesson for himself when he was in the wilderness and when things weren't appearing to go his way. This afternoon we read a portion of the account from the book of 1 Samuel. And in that account, David and his men, they have been out in the wilderness of Maon. And they're in need of provisions. They're hungry and they're tired and they're harried. And so in their circumstances, what they did was to appeal to aid. They appealed for aid from a rich man named Nabal who lived in that area. A rich man who owed them a debt of gratitude for David having protected and for having cared for his flocks. But when Nabal receives David's request, he refuses it. And he doesn't just refuse to help David, he refuses to help David in the most insulting way possible. Because if you look back earlier in this chapter, you'll see how Nabal responds, and he responds this way. He said, "Who is this David? Who is this David fellow anyways? And why would he ever dare to believe that I would take from my riches to satisfy his need?" Now, when we read about Nabal responding that way, and we know of his great wealth, and we know of David's desperate need, we have a tendency to identify Nabal's sin as being greed. And of course, at one level, that was the nature of Nabal's sin. But there's actually a deeper sin, and there's a far deeper insult here as well. And the deeper sin is Nabal's scorn for the Lord's will. It's his scorn for the anointed one of the Lord. Who is David, he asks, as if he doesn't know. You see, this was just Nabal's way of saying that he knew that David wasn't the king, and he didn't think that he ever would be. And so he couldn't see that there was any reason to feel at all inclined to help David in his hour of need. And that insult in his hour of need, it rubs David the wrong way. And perhaps it rubbed him the wrong way because there was a little anxious voice inside of David's head that was wondering the same things as Nabal was. Maybe there was a little anxious voice in David's head that was wondering if God would ever really make good on his promises to grant him the crown. Would God really make him king? Would God really grant him security? It must have been so hard to believe that. Well, David was out there in the wilderness, hungry and harried by his foes. It must have been so hard for David to imagine that somehow or other that promised crown was going to be his. David, he couldn't clearly see the way ahead. And in his frailty and in his anxiety, David decides that he is going to act. And he decides that he may not be king, but he's going to act like he is. And he decides that he is going to go and he is going to bring justice down on Nabal and his household. Now, by God's grace, David was prevented from following through with his plan. And he was prevented by, of all people, Nabal's wife, Abigail. Abigail, who didn't just have a concern for her husband's life, but Abigail, who had a sincere concern for David's crown, and who had a genuine concern for God's promises. And how was it that Abigail stayed David's hand? How did she stop him from taking matters into his own hands and meting out his own justice? Well, let's read again what she has to say in that passage. Let's read again verses 28 and following. What does she say there? She says, "Please forgive the trespass of your servant, for the Lord will certainly make my Lord a sure house, because my Lord is fighting the battles of the Lord, and evil shall not be found in you as long as you live. If men rise up to pursue you and to seek your life, then the life of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of the living in the care of the Lord your God, and the lives of your enemies he shall sling out as from the hollow of a sling." What does Abigail do in these verses? Well, first of all, what she reminds David is that it will be the Lord who will make him a sure house. She says to him, trust in the Lord to establish you. Trust in the Lord to be the one to be a stronghold and to build you a stronghold. And then she reminds him that even if his circumstances would suggest that the crown might never come to him, because he is being pursued and because he is being harried by wicked men, that even if his circumstances seem grim, that he shouldn't make the mistake of despairing of God's faithfulness. He shouldn't make the mistake of doubting God's promises. And why not? Why shouldn't David fall into that pattern? Because, she says, David's life had been bound in the bundle of the living. What a beautiful phrase that is. What an encouraging phrase for David to hear. David, you're out here in the desert. David, you're out here hungry and tired. David, you're out here being harried and hunted by your foes. But David, your life has been bound in the bundle of the living. And what Abigail meant is that David's life, it couldn't be taken from him. It couldn't be taken from him by hunger. It couldn't be taken from him by his foes. And it couldn't be taken from him because his life was in the care of the Lord. And he was the recipient of God's sure and certain promises. Loved ones, that's what David needed to know. That's what David needed to know in order to quiet that anxious voice in his head. That's what he needed to know in order to keep him from making the mistake of ceasing to rest in the Lord and of taking things into his own hands. That's what he needed to know to stop him from making his own way forward. He needed to know that his life had been bound in the bundle of the living. And by God's grace, David gets the message. And we know that David gets the message because of the way that he responds to Abigail. Consider again what David says. He begins by thanking God. He thanks God for having sent Abigail to meet him on the way. And he acknowledges that her actions have kept him from sin. He says, what you have done in intercepting me in this way, it's kept me from blood guilt. It's kept me from unlawfully taking the life of another man. But David goes on and he says something even more significant. He says that Abigail's actions, they have kept him from trying to work out his own salvation by means of his own hand. David says, I recognize what I was doing now. I was trying to lay hold of the promises that God had made in my own strength and in my own power. I was trying to bring about my own salvation. And having made that acknowledgement, we hear that David humbles himself and he is, says the scripture, obedient to her command. He restrains himself from wickedness against Nabal. Do you see that, loved ones? David had to learn that because his life had been bound in the bundle of the living, because his life was in the hands of the living God, that not only didn't he need to fend for himself, but he could confidently hand his life and he could confidently hand his cause over to the Lord. He had to learn that he could proceed without living in fear, that he could keep going without being afraid of men like Nabal, because the Lord would be the one to establish his cause. And by God's grace, David, having learned that lesson, he doesn't just keep that lesson to himself. No, by God's grace, David wanted all of God's people to know that their lives had also been bound in the bundle. He wanted them to know that God would be just as sure a refuge for them as he had been for David. And so, wanting God's people to know of these things, wanting God's people to be sure of these things, David sang. And he sang of what the Lord had taught him. And Psalm 27 is one example of an occasion when David did so. Psalm 27, which opens with the declaration that the Lord was David's light. Here David confesses that it had not been by his own wisdom, it had not been by his own intelligence that he had been enabled to see the way forward. Here he confesses that he's not going to be the one to determine where he will go and how he will get here. No, God, he says, would be his light. And as the psalmists say elsewhere, God would light the pathway before him. And God would provide enough light so that David could move forward without fear of stumbling, and so that he could move forward without fear of straying from the path. And God isn't just a light for his people. God is also their salvation. Once again, beloved, we've got to be reminded that our salvation is not something that we can earn. It's not something that we can merit. It's not something that we can secure or lay hold of in our own righteousness and strength. No, salvation is a gift that comes to God's people from the Lord. The Lord who not only shows us the way, but the Lord who in His Son, Jesus Christ, in His obedience, in His sacrifice and death and resurrection, has become the way of life for His people. In Jesus Christ, we find the way of salvation. And the Lord isn't just the light and the salvation of His people, He's also their stronghold. Here in his own words, in Psalm 27, David acknowledges that his life had been bound in the bundle. He's saying here, when he declares the Lord to be his stronghold, that his life is secure because it's held safely in the hands of the living and the Almighty God. And since there is no power that is greater than his, there's nothing that can be done to end his life. There's nothing that can be done to alter the path or the course of his life as the Lord has decreed it to be. And these admissions, these acknowledgments, they have consequences. David declares that he doesn't need to take matters into his own hands because he's content that he is in God's hands. And he doesn't need to live in fear of his foes, regardless of who they might be. And David acknowledges that this is true no matter how great an opposition he might face. And we see him doing that in verse 3. There David says that if armies or if war were to come against him, that such things won't disquiet his spirit and that such things won't shake his confidence in God. But notice here how David also acknowledges that living in such confidence, it isn't something that he is able to do in his own strength. And so we listen in verse 4 as David prays to the Lord. We listen as David cries out and as he petitions God to grant him the blessing, not just of entering into that stronghold, but of remaining there and of residing there. Here David acknowledges that his heart's desire still has to be granted to him by God. And in so doing, he makes an honest admission of his own frailty. He makes an honest admission of his own dependence. But having made that request, David hasn't got any doubts at all about God's willingness to grant that petition. For immediately after offering up that petition in verse 4, then in verse 5, David confidently exclaims that God will grant him his request. And he says that God will come and God will come to be his aid in the day of trouble. And that God will secure him in the stronghold, and that God will shelter him in his tent, and that God will set him high upon a rock. And that image of being set high upon a rock, it's such a beautiful image, it's such a powerful image, and it's one we find so frequently in the Psalms. There's an implicit acknowledgement when David speaks about being lifted up and being set on a rock. There's an implicit acknowledgement here that God does not promise his children a trouble-free journey through this life. God doesn't promise us that at no point will we experience hardship or difficulty. He doesn't tell us that there won't be times when we're oppressed and attacked and harried. But what he does promise us is that we won't ever be overwhelmed by those storms of life. And he tells us that we won't be overwhelmed because he will raise us above them. I often have that image in my mind of being lifted high up and set on a rock, of being set on a rock that is higher than we are. You can imagine a rock in the middle of the ocean, right? And it's a powerful ocean that is slamming up against that rock. There are waves that are crashing into that rock all around it. And yet, the person who's standing on that rock is above the waves. It's not that the waves aren't there, but the waves have no ability to overwhelm that person. And that's what David declares right here. He's confident that God will come to him in his hour of need, and that God will lift him up, and that he will establish him firmly on a rock. And he will do so in the midst of the most trying times. And loved ones, the amazing thing about this picture of shelter and this picture of comfort and security, the amazing thing is how this picture, it only gets magnified, how it only gets increased in the New Testament as a result of Jesus' obedience and sacrifice. Because it turns out that there's an analog to Abigail's Old Testament declaration about being bound in the bundle. There's an analog, there is a parallel to that in the New Testament. And it's the Apostle Paul. It's the Apostle Paul who reminds us that the lives of God's people, that they have been bound in the bundle. And indeed, that they've been bound in a bundle in an even more profound way. Turn with me for a moment to the letter to the Colossians, Colossians chapter 3. We'll just read the first few verses of Colossians chapter 3. Colossians 3:1, Paul writes, "If then you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things that are above, not on things that are on earth, for you have died." And now here's the important part. "And your life is hidden with Christ in God." Your life is hidden with Christ in God. Do you hear what Paul is saying there? How on account of Christ's death and resurrection, we also have been raised up with him. And we've been raised up with him to a new life. And that new life that we have received in Jesus Christ, that new life is hidden with him in God. We've got to understand that this is Paul's way of saying that the lives of God's children, all of them, those lives have been bound up in the bundle of the living. And in a way that's far more profound than even David had enjoyed at the time that Abigail stayed his hand. Because think about it for a moment. When Abigail came, when she came to intercept David, her point was to say that David didn't need to be afraid of his human foes because they could not keep him from receiving the crown of Israel. But Paul's point is to assure us that our spiritual foes of sin, Satan, and death, that they cannot keep us from receiving the crown of life. And our spiritual foes cannot keep us from receiving the crown of life because our lives are hidden in the stronghold. Our lives have been hidden with Christ in God. And nobody can assault them in that most secure of strongholds. Loved ones, that's the comfort, the wonderful comfort of the gospel. And it's the sure and certain comfort we have as we look forward to another year ahead. For having believed on Christ, our lives have been hidden with him in God. And so they can't be taken from us, nor can the path that God has laid out for us be altered or changed in any way. And in that sure confidence, we are then able to do exactly what it is that David urges us to do at the end of Psalm 27. In that confidence, we are able to wait upon the Lord, and we're able to do so without fear or anxiety. And so the question that comes to us this afternoon is this: have we believed upon him? Have we acknowledged him to be our light and our salvation and our stronghold? And if we have, brothers and sisters, then there is no reason to be afraid. There is no reason to be anxious. There's no reason to be overwhelmed. Rather, there's every reason to cry out to him. There's every reason to beseech him, just as David did, to shelter us in his tent, to bring us into his stronghold, to lift us up and set us high upon a rock. There is every reason to beseech him to secure us in the stronghold. And then we have every reason to go forward into 2024 knowing with a sure confidence that the one who has saved our lives will keep our lives no matter what the year ahead might hold. Amen.